The suitcase hit the pavement first. Then my golf clubs, the bag splitting at the seam, clubs scattering across the asphalt like something had exploded. Then my suits, still on their hangers, thrown in an armful over the porch railing so they landed in the rose bushes my mother-in-law had planted the summer before. I was standing at the end of my own driveway on a Saturday afternoon in June, watching 40 of my wife's closest friends and family members go silent one by one as they realized what they were witnessing. Whitney stood on the top step of the porch, one hand still gripping the handle of my leather duffel bag, her face flushed the particular shade of red that comes from wine and rage in equal measure. She'd just thrown 4 years of my life onto the front lawn in front of an audience, and she was breathing like she'd finished a race. "Get off my family's property," she said. Loud enough for the caterers to hear. Loud enough for her mother, standing near the drinks table with a glass of Prosecco frozen halfway to her lips, to hear. Loud enough for everyone. I didn't move. I didn't raise my voice. I stood there in the driveway of the house I had lived in for 2 years, looking at the scattered wreckage of my belongings on the grass, and I felt something settle into place in my chest that I can only describe as clarity. That's when I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me. Slow, unhurried, the sound of someone who has all the time in the world and no interest in rushing toward a scene. I turned. It was Harold Whitfield, our next-door neighbor, 68 years old, retired, the kind of man who wore cardigans in June and had a standing rule about not getting involved in other people's business. In 2 years of living beside him, I'd exchanged maybe 40 words with the man. A wave over the hedge. A comment about the weather. A thank you the time he helped me jump my car battery. He walked right past me. Right up the driveway, past the scattered suits, past the shattered golf bag, until he was standing at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at Whitney with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Something between disbelief and disgust. "Whitney," he said, "do you have any idea what you just did?" She blinked at him, confused, still riding the high of her own performance. "Harold, this really isn't." "Derek Callahan," he said. Not to her. To the crowd. He said my name like it was the answer to a question none of them had thought to ask. The silence that followed was different from the silence before it. That first silence had been the silence of 40 people watching a woman throw her husband's belongings onto a lawn, a silence full of second-hand embarrassment and the particular thrill people feel watching a marriage end in public. This new silence was heavier. This silence had a question mark hanging over it. "I know him," Harold said, still looking at Whitney. "Rather better than you seem to, apparently. Before I tell you what happened next, because what happened next changed the rest of my life, and hers, and her family's, in ways none of them saw coming, let me tell you how I ended up standing in that driveway in the first place. Because the story of how I got there is the story of every small collapse that came before the big one, and if you've ever spent years being quietly diminished by people who were supposed to love you, I think you'll recognize the shape of it. My name is Derek Callahan. I'm 39 years old. I own a logistics analytics company called Northline, based out of Providence, Rhode Island, with a satellite office in Boston. We build routing and forecasting software for mid-size freight carriers, the kind of unglamorous, invisible infrastructure work that keeps grocery stores stocked and warehouses moving. Last year we did $14 million in revenue. We employ 61 people. None of that meant anything to the Sinclair family, not really, not in the way it should have, because to them, money that didn't come with the right last name attached to it was just noise. I grew up in Pawtucket, 20 minutes outside Providence, in a house my father bought in 1987 for $11,000 and spent the next 3 decades slowly fixing with his own hands. My dad, Walt, worked the docks and then a machine shop for 31 years. My mother cleaned houses on the east side of the city, including, for 6 years, a house 2 streets over from the one Whitney grew up in, though neither of us knew that until after the wedding, and I've never told her family, because I knew exactly what they would have done with that information. I built Northline out of my apartment when I was 29, coding the first version of the routing engine myself after 14-hour days at a logistics firm where I'd been told, twice, that I didn't have the right pedigree to move into strategy. I met Whitney Sinclair at a charity gala in Newport 6 years ago. I was there because Northline had just signed its first 7-figure client and someone on the client's board had invited me as a courtesy. She was there because her family had been attending that gala since before she was born. She was 28, sharp, funny in a way that surprised me given where she came from, and she asked me more questions about my company in 20 minutes than most people asked in a year. I fell for her fast. I want to be honest about that, because it matters for what comes later. I wasn't blind to who her family was. I knew exactly what kind of world she came from. I told myself it didn't matter, because she wasn't like them. For a while, I believed that. We dated for 2 years. Good years, mostly, the kind where I still believed the family dynamics I was noticing at the edges of things were something we'd figure out together once we were actually married, once she had a reason to stop deferring to them and start building something that was fully ours. I proposed on the waterfront in Newport, near the same club where we'd met, and she cried in a way that felt entirely unguarded, entirely real, nothing like the composed woman I'd watch her become at family functions over the years that followed. We got married at a vineyard in the Berkshires, 180 guests, string lights strung between the trellises, the kind of wedding that costs more than most people's first house and that the Sinclairs paid for almost entirely, a fact Constance mentioned at least once at every anniversary dinner for the next 4 years. Usually phrased as a gentle reminder rather than a genuine compliment. Edmund gave the father of the bride toast. I remember it clearly, because I stood there in a rented tuxedo that had cost more than any suit I'd owned before that year, listening to him talk for nearly 10 minutes about Whitney, about her childhood, about her years at Georgetown, about the pride he felt watching her grow into the woman standing beside me. He mentioned Preston's recent promotion. He mentioned Constance's tireless work on the museum board. He raised his glass to everyone who helped make this day possible, a list that included the caterer by name and did not include me at all, not once, not even in passing, not even the customary line new sons-in-law usually get folded into somewhere near the end. I noticed. Whitney noticed too, I could tell, because her hand found mine under the table the moment he sat back down, a small squeeze that felt, at the time, like an apology and a promise both. I let it go. That became something of a pattern. Edmund Sinclair, my father-in-law, owns a chain of boutique hotels across New England, 11 properties, the kind of business that looks glamorous from the outside and runs, from what I could tell over the years, on a combination of inherited capital and an almost pathological aversion to risk. Constance, Whitney's mother, doesn't work, hasn't in 30 years, and fills her days with charity boards and the kind of quiet social warfare that wealthy women in small towns specialize in. Whitney's younger brother, Preston, 27 at the time all this happened, worked in business development at his father's company, a title that as far as I could ever tell meant taking long lunches and calling it networking. For the first year of our marriage, the slights were small enough that I could tell myself I was imagining them. Edmund would ask me about the software thing at dinner the way you'd ask a teenager about a part-time job. Constance introduced me to her friends as Whitney's husband. He does something with trucks, every single time, for 4 years, even after I corrected her the first 6 times. Preston liked to make jokes about real jobs versus jobs where you stared at a laptop all day, this from a man whose entire professional output, as far as I ever witnessed, was a single hotel loyalty app that launched 18 months late and 40% over budget. I took it. I want to be honest about that too. I took it because I loved Whitney, and because for a long time she seemed embarrassed by her family's behavior on my behalf. She'd squeeze my hand under the table. She'd apologize in the car on the drive home. "They don't mean it the way it sounds," she'd say. "They just don't know how to talk about anything that isn't old money." I believed her, because I wanted to, and because the alternative, that she agreed with them, that some part of her saw me the same way, was not something I let myself consider. The house on Brookhaven Lane in Weston, Connecticut, came into the picture during our second year of marriage. It's a 5-bedroom colonial on 2 acres, the kind of property that photographs well and costs more to heat than most people's mortgages. Officially, the story the Sinclair family told everyone, told their friends, told the neighbors, told Whitney's book club, was that Edmund and Constance had gifted it to us as a wedding present, a generous gesture from a loving family welcoming a new son-in-law into the fold. That was the story. It was not, in fact, entirely true, and the gap between the story and the truth is the hinge this whole thing turns on. Here's what actually happened. Edmund had put down a deposit on the house 18 months before the wedding, back when he'd been planning to buy it as an investment property for one of his hotel expansion plans that never materialized. When the deal for the hotel site fell through, he was sitting on a half-finished purchase and a deposit he didn't want to lose, and the wedding gave him a convenient, generous-looking exit. He finished the purchase, put the deed in both our names as a wedding gift, and got to tell the story of the benevolent father-in-law for the rest of his life at every dinner party from Greenwich to Newport. What none of them knew, what I never told anyone except my attorney and, eventually, my brother, is that 14 months into the marriage, Northline closed a Series B round that put a significant amount of capital directly into my hands for the first time in my adult life. And around the same time, a leak in the master bathroom revealed a structural issue in the house's original foundation work that Edmund's contractor had cut corners on 20 years earlier, before he'd even bought it, an issue that was going to cost close to $200,000 to properly fix. Edmund, upon hearing the estimate, went quiet in a way I recognized immediately, because I've seen investors go quiet the exact same way when a deal turns out to be worse than the pitch deck promised. I paid for it. All of it. And I did something else, something I never discussed with Whitney, because at the time it felt like the responsible move of a man protecting his family's asset, not a man protecting himself. I had my attorney, a sharp, patient woman named Renata Cho who has represented Northline since its earliest days, quietly restructure the ownership of the property. Edmund and Constance, needing the $200,000 and not particularly wanting to have that conversation with their friends about why the gift house needed emergency structural repairs, agreed to transfer their remaining interest in the property into a holding entity I controlled, called DRC Holdings, in exchange for me covering the full cost of the repair and for giving a personal loan I'd extended to Edmund's hotel group the year before, a loan of $90,000 that had gone conveniently unmentioned at every family dinner since. To the outside world, nothing changed. Whitney still called it our house. Her parents still told the gift story at parties. But on paper, the house at 14, Brookhaven Lane belonged, entirely and exclusively, to DRC Holdings LLC, a company with exactly one owner. Me. I never told Whitney. I've turned that decision over in my head more times than I can count since everything happened, and I still don't fully know how to feel about it. Part of me tells myself I was being a good business owner, protecting an asset the way you protect any asset, keeping personal and family finances clean and separate the way I'd been trained to by every mentor I'd ever had. Part of me knows I was also quietly preparing for something I hadn't let myself admit I was already afraid of. Because by year 3, the small things had stopped feeling small. Whitney started going to Weston Country Club events without me, telling me they were just the girls, and then I'd see the photos later with Blake Whitmore in half of them, always positioned a little too close, always laughing a little too easily at whatever he'd just said. Blake was a hotel investor, 36, divorced, the kind of man who wore boat shoes without irony and had inherited enough money to make investor sound like a real job rather than a lifestyle. He and Edmund had done business together for years. He'd been at our wedding. I noticed the way Whitney's phone started living face down on tables. I noticed the way she stopped asking about Northline, stopped asking about the 2 new enterprise contracts we closed that spring, stopped asking about anything that happened between 8 in the morning and 7 at night, as though my entire professional life had quietly become a subject she'd lost interest in. I noticed the way Constance started referring to the house in ways that pointedly excluded me. When Whitney redos the kitchen, the plans Whitney has for the guest wing, never once our plans or the plans you two have. There was a specific night, in April, 2 months before the garden party, that I've thought about more than almost any other moment in that whole marriage. Whitney told me she was at the club for a charity committee meeting, the kind of thing that ran until 9 or 10 most Thursdays. I'd had a late call with a client in Denver that ended earlier than expected, and I drove out to the club myself afterward, not to check up on her, or at least that's what I told myself at the time, but because I thought I'd surprise her, take her to a late dinner somewhere, do something for the marriage that neither of us had done in a while. The committee meeting had ended at 7. The front desk told me so without me even having to ask directly, a young woman at the check-in podium who had no idea what she was handing me when she mentioned it. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a while after that, the kind of stillness that isn't calm so much as a system quietly rerouting itself around new information, and then I drove home. Whitney got in at 10:40. She told me the meeting had run long, that they'd gone to get a drink after to finish discussing the auction logistics. I didn't say anything about the front desk. I filed it away instead, the way I'd started filing away every small thing by then, a growing folder of dates and inconsistencies that I told myself I was keeping for no particular reason, the same way you tell yourself you're keeping a fire extinguisher in the garage for no particular reason, right up until the day you need it. 2 weeks after that, I saw a text notification light up her phone on the kitchen counter while she was upstairs changing, a name I didn't recognize saved simply as BW, the message preview reading only can't stop thinking about Saturday, before the screen went dark again. I didn't pick up the phone. I've never once, in the entirety of that marriage, gone through my wife's phone, and I didn't start that night either, not because I wasn't tempted but because some part of me already understood I wasn't going to need to. The pattern was already writing itself clearly enough without my help. I didn't confront anyone. Not because I was afraid, and not because I didn't have the evidence to do it. I've spent a decade building a company by reading a room before I say a word in it, by knowing exactly what I have before I show my hand. I watched. I documented, quietly, the way you document anything you might need later, screenshots, dates, a growing folder on a hard drive that lived nowhere near our shared cloud account. And I waited to see how far it would go. I remember one dinner in particular, the winter of our 3rd year, that I've come back to more than any other since everything happened, because it was the night I first understood exactly how little ground I actually stood on with that family, even after 3 years of trying. It was a Sunday, the Sinclair's standing tradition, dinner at the house in Weston at 6, the same table every week, the same seating arrangement, Edmund at the head, Constance to his right, Whitney and me across from Preston. That particular night, Preston had brought a date, a woman named Caroline who worked in private wealth management at a bank in Greenwich, and the conversation, as it always did, orbited entirely around things I had no stake in. Edmund talked for 20 minutes about a hotel acquisition he was considering in Newport. Constance discussed a fundraising gala she was chairing for a museum board. Preston described, in more detail than the story warranted, a golf outing with a client whose family owned half a shipping conglomerate. Nobody asked about Northline. I'd closed our first 8-figure contract that same week, the biggest deal in company history at the time, a deal I'd spent 4 months negotiating personally, flying to Cleveland twice to sit across from a carrier's board and convince them our routing engine could save them 11% on fuel costs in the first year alone. I hadn't mentioned it yet at the table, waiting, the way I usually did, for someone to ask. Nobody asked. Derek, Caroline said eventually, more out of politeness than genuine curiosity, the way you'd finally address the one person at a dinner party who hadn't spoken in half an hour. Whitney mentioned you run some kind of tech company. Logistics software, I said. We help freight carriers optimize their routing and reduce fuel costs. We actually just closed our biggest contract to date this week, an 8-figure deal with a Midwest carrier. That sounds interesting, Caroline said, and I could tell she meant it, that she was the kind of person actually paying attention to numbers when she heard them. It's fairly technical work, Edmund said, cutting in before I could say anything further, in the tone he always used when he wanted to redirect a conversation back toward himself. Derek's very good at the technical side of things. We've talked about having him look at our booking system sometime, haven't we, Derek? We had never talked about that. Not once, in 3 years. It was the kind of thing Edmund said at dinners, a phantom collaboration he liked to imply existed, because it let him sound generous and interested without ever actually having to ask me a real question about my work. We haven't, actually, I said, keeping my voice light. But I'd be happy to take a look sometime. 8 figures, Caroline said, impressed, apparently still processing the number. That's remarkable for a company your size. It is, I said. It took 4 months and 2 trips to Cleveland to close. Cleveland, Preston said, with the particular smirk he reserved for anything he considered beneath him. God, I don't think I could do business in Cleveland. No offense, Derek, I'm sure it's charming. The client's headquartered there, I said. Cleveland doesn't need to be charming. It needs to sign the contract. A small ripple of laughter went around the table, and for a moment I thought the conversation might actually turn toward me, toward the deal, toward the 11% fuel savings I was genuinely proud of. Instead, Constance leaned toward Caroline and asked about her family's summer place in Nantucket, and the conversation moved on entirely, the 8-figure contract already forgotten, already less interesting to the table than a house on an island none of them had asked me a single question about in 3 years, because I'd never had one to discuss. I caught Whitney's eye across the table. She gave me the same small, apologetic smile she always gave me in those moments, the one that said I know, I'm sorry, they don't mean it, without ever once actually saying anything to the table itself. I used to find that smile reassuring. That winter, for the first time, I found myself wondering what exactly she thought it was accomplishing, offered silently across a table instead of spoken out loud where it might have actually changed something. I remember sitting through the rest of that dinner watching Whitney across the table, hoping she might circle back to the deal herself, might say something like tell them about Cleveland, Derek, the way a partner does when they're proud of you and want the room to know it. She didn't. She let the conversation move to Nantucket and stayed there, contributing her own memories of the island, easy and fluent in a language I had never once been taught the grammar of. It wasn't that she was being cruel. I want to be fair about that. I don't think she was even aware, in that moment, that she'd let the biggest professional win of my year evaporate into a conversation about somebody else's summer house. That, in its own way, was the more troubling part. It had simply stopped occurring to her that it should matter to the table at all. On the drive home that night, I told her about the deal in full, the 4 months, the 2 trips to Cleveland, the 11%, and she listened, and she was proud of me, genuinely, the way she always was in the car, in private, away from her family's table. You should have told them, she said. That's incredible, Derek. I tried, I said. Your father redirected it into a story about his booking system that doesn't exist. I know, she said. I'm sorry. She stopped herself before finishing the sentence, the way she always did, and I remember thinking, driving down that dark parkway with my wife apologizing on behalf of people who weren't in the car to hear it, that I had started to understand something uncomfortable about our marriage. The apology only ever happened where it cost her nothing. It never once happened at the table, in front of the people who needed to hear it. I let it go. I always let it go, because the alternative felt, at the time, like making a bigger deal out of a family's manners than the situation warranted, and because some part of me still believed that if I was patient enough, if I closed enough deals, if I was simply successful enough for long enough, eventually they would run out of ways to make it about anything other than respect. I was wrong about that. I understand now that it was never going to be about the deals. It went as far as the garden party. If you're finding this story compelling so far, I'd really appreciate it if you hit subscribe. We tell true, character-driven stories like this one every week, and it genuinely helps the channel grow when you're here for the next one. The party was Constance's idea, officially thrown to celebrate the 4th anniversary of the gift of the house. An anniversary nobody had ever celebrated in the 3 years prior, which in hindsight should have told me something. 40 guests, caterers, a string quartet on the back lawn, the whole production. I'd been at a client meeting in Hartford that ran long, an emergency call with a carrier whose entire routing system had gone down 2 days before their busiest shipping week of the quarter, the kind of fire I couldn't leave burning no matter what was happening at home. I texted Whitney I'd be 20 minutes late. She didn't respond. I pulled into the driveway at 4:40 in the afternoon, and the first thing I saw was my suitcase sitting open on the front lawn, my clothes half spilling out of it into the grass. I got out of the car slowly. I remember that specifically, moving slowly, because some instinct in me understood before the rest of me caught up that whatever was happening needed to be met with stillness, not panic. Whitney was already on the porch, and the moment she saw my car she started moving, going back inside and coming back out with my golf bag, hauling it with both hands to the porch railing and heaving it over. The bag split when it hit the ground. Clubs everywhere. "Whitney," I said. Not loud. Just her name. "You want to know why?" She called back, and her voice had the particular pitch of someone who has been building up to a moment for a long time and finally gets to have it, in front of the audience she's always wanted for it. "Ask Blake. Ask him what I told him this morning. Ask him what I've decided." Around us, 40 people had gone completely still. Constance stood near the drinks table, a hand pressed to her chest in a performance of shock that didn't quite reach her eyes, which told me she'd known this was coming. Edmund stood a little apart, jaw tight, staring at the ground. Preston had his phone half raised, like some part of him was already thinking about content. And near the hedge line, Blake Whitmore stood with a drink in his hand, watching the whole thing with an expression that was trying very hard to look neutral and failing. "I've been carrying you for 4 years, Whitney said, coming down the porch steps now, one of my suit jackets in her hand, which she threw next, landing across the rose bushes. Every dinner, watching my father pretend to care about your little software company. Every party, explaining to people why I married someone who grew up the way you grew up. Do you know what it's like, Derek, being the woman whose husband people are quietly sorry for her about?" I stood in the driveway and let her say it. "I want to be honest with you about what that felt like, because I think there's a version of this story where I perform outrage for you, where I tell you I felt nothing but fury, and that wouldn't be true. It hurt. For years of a marriage, reduced in front of 40 people to a sentence about being carried, about pity, said by the same mouth that had told me, 100 times in private, that she didn't care what her family thought, that she loved me exactly as I was. I felt that particular kind of hurt that doesn't have room to be angry yet because it's still too busy being hurt. But I've spent 20 years in rooms where showing your hand too early costs you everything." I stood still. I didn't raise my voice. I looked at my wife throwing my clothes onto her parents' lawn in front of an audience assembled specifically, I now understood, to witness this, and I said the only thing I had to say. "Is that everything?" It wasn't the reaction she wanted. I could see it land wrong on her face, the confusion of someone who'd rehearsed a scene where the other person breaks, and instead got quiet, and the quiet threw her more than shouting would have. "Get off my family's property," she said, louder now, covering the crack in her composure with volume. "This was never really your house anyway, Derek. It was a gift. To me. My father bought it." And that's when Harold Whitfield came walking up the driveway. I told you at the start of this how that moment went. Harold, in his cardigan, walking past me without a word, stopping at the base of the porch steps, and saying my full name to a silent crowd like the answer to a question nobody had thought to ask yet. "Harold," Whitney said, "this really isn't." "Derek Callahan," Harold said again, louder this time, looking around at the guests, at Edmund, at Constance, before settling back on Whitney. "I know him. Rather better than you seem to, apparently." What none of them knew about Harold Whitfield, what I'd known for exactly 18 months and never once mentioned to my own wife, for reasons that felt reasonable at the time and feel almost prophetic in hindsight, is that Harold spent 34 years as a real estate transactional attorney in Fairfield County before retiring next door to us 3 years ago. And when I restructured the ownership of the house through DRC Holdings, when Edmund and Constance quietly signed over their interest in exchange for $200,000 in repairs and a forgiven loan, I hadn't used a big Boston firm for the closing. Renata had recommended someone local, discreet, someone who wouldn't be chatting about the details at the next Weston Country Club mixer. She'd recommended Harold, doing one last piece of consulting work before fully retiring, a man who happened to already live next door to the property in question and had, in fact, walked over one Tuesday afternoon 18 months earlier with a folder of documents for me to sign at my own kitchen table, because it was easier than driving into the city. "Whitney," Harold said, and his voice had the calm, unhurried patience of a man who has spent 3 decades delivering unwelcome news to people who thought they knew what they owned. I did the closing on the title transfer for this property myself, 18 months ago. At that kitchen table. He nodded toward the house behind her. This house belongs to DRC Holdings LLC. It has for a year and a half. Your father knows this. I'd assumed, given how comfortable you seem throwing things onto the lawn, that you did too. I watched the color drain out of Whitney's face in real time. That's not, she started. Ask your father, Harold said simply. Every head on that lawn turned to Edmund Sinclair, who had gone very still near the drinks table, his Prosecco glass sweating in his hand, his eyes fixed somewhere on the middle distance like a man doing very fast math and not liking any of the answers. Dad? Whitney said. Edmund didn't answer right away. And in the silence that followed, in front of 40 guests who had come to watch a spectacle and were now witnessing something far more interesting than the one they'd expected, I saw something shift in the crowd, a recalibration happening in real time, the same recalibration I'd watched happen in boardrooms 100 times before, the moment a room realizes who actually holds the power in a negotiation they thought they understood. Edmund, Constance said, her voice sharp now, tell her that's not true. It's true, Edmund said quietly. We needed the foundation repair covered. Derek covered it. In exchange, we transferred our share into his holding company. It seemed reasonable at the time. You gave away my house, Whitney said, and for the first time in the entire confrontation, her voice cracked, not with performance but with something real underneath it, and you didn't tell me? It didn't come up, Edmund said, which was, I thought, one of the more remarkable understatements I'd heard in my professional or personal life. Constance turned on me next, the way people do when they need somewhere to put the humiliation and can't yet direct it at their own husband in front of an audience. This is exactly the kind of thing I'd expect from someone like you, she said, her voice carrying easily across the lawn. Sneaking around behind a family's back, taking advantage of an old man who trusted you enough to let you marry his daughter. Constance, I said, and I kept my voice level, though something in me had finally, quietly, stopped absorbing things the way I had for 4 years. Your husband came to me because his own bank wouldn't extend him the credit to fix a foundation problem his contractor created 20 years before I ever met your family. I paid $200,000 to fix a house I didn't grow up thinking I was entitled to inherit. I don't think taking advantage is the phrase you're looking for. Preston, phone still half raised, apparently decided this was his moment to be useful. Come on, man, you can't seriously think you deserve the house just because you covered some repairs, he said. That's not how family works. You're right, I said, turning to him. That's not how family works. I learned that 4 years ago, at my first dinner at this table, when your father introduced my company as the software thing in front of 11 of his friends. I've had a great deal of time since then to learn exactly how family works in this house, Preston. This is simply the first time the lesson has run in my direction instead of yours. He didn't have an answer for that. Nobody at that table ever had an answer for anything that wasn't delivered on their terms, in their language, at a volume they could control. I'd spent 4 years speaking that language back to them as carefully as I could. That afternoon, for the first time, I stopped bothering to translate. I want to pause here and tell you what I felt, standing in that driveway, watching a family that had spent 4 years making me feel like an outsider in my own marriage suddenly discover that the ground they'd been standing on, quite literally, belonged to me. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that, because I think the satisfying version of this story is the one where I felt vindicated in that instant, where some door swung open and light poured through it. What I actually felt was tired. Tired in a way that went all the way down. For years of small cruelties, dressed up as jokes, dressed up as concern, dressed up as they don't mean it the way it sounds, and it had taken a real estate attorney in a cardigan announcing a technicality to make any of them treat me like I belonged on that lawn at all. But underneath the tired, something else was starting to form. Something cold and clear, the same feeling I get in a negotiation the moment I realize the other side has shown me their full position and I still have cards they don't know about. Whitney, I said, and my voice was steady, and I meant for it to be, "You asked me to leave your family's property. I'd like to clarify something for you, and for everyone here, since apparently that's what today is for." I looked at the crowd, at Constance's frozen expression, at Preston lowering his phone at last, at Blake Whitmore trying to become invisible near the hedge. "This is not your family's property. It's mine. Has been for a year and a half." I bent down, unhurried, and picked my suit jacket up out of the rose bushes. I shook it out. I folded it over my arm. "I'm not going to make you leave right now," I said to Whitney, "because I understand you have guests, and because I'm not interested in making a scene the way you just tried to. But I want you to understand what's happening here. You wanted a divorce badly enough to ask me for it in front of your parents' friends, with my clothes on the lawn as the exhibit. I'm going to give you exactly that. Cleanly. Legally. Starting Monday morning." "Derek," she started. "I'll be at the Marriott downtown," I said. "You'll hear from my attorney." I picked up the rest of my suits from the bushes, gathered what I could carry, left the golf clubs scattered on the grass because in that moment they genuinely did not matter to me, and I walked to my car while 40 people who had come to watch a wife humiliate her husband watched, instead, a man walk away with more composure than any of them expected, carrying an armful of wrinkled suits like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Harold caught up with me at the end of the driveway. "You didn't know I'd say anything today," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "No," I admitted. "I had no idea you were even at this party." "Constance invited half the street," he said. "Guess she wanted witnesses." He looked back at the house, at the party visibly dissolving behind us, guests drifting toward their cars in that particular hurry people move at when they've just watched something they're desperate to gossip about somewhere else. "For what it's worth, Derek, I've lived next to that family a long time. I've watched the way they talk to you. Always thought somebody ought to remind them who was actually holding things together over there. I appreciate you saying my name today, Harold." He shrugged, the gesture of a man who had spent 3 decades being scrupulously neutral in every closing and finally got to enjoy one. Seemed like the moment called for it. I drove to the Marriott downtown with a back seat full of suits and a passenger seat full of nothing, and somewhere around the Merritt Parkway, I started making calls. The first call was to Renata Cho. She picked up on the second ring, which for a Saturday evening told me she'd probably already heard something was happening, because Weston is a small enough town that news like this moves faster than I could drive. "Derek," she said. "I take it something's happened." I told her everything. The garden party, the suitcase on the lawn, Harold's timing, Edmund's confession, all of it, in the flat, sequential way I've learned to deliver bad news to people whose job is to fix it rather than feel it with me. "I want the divorce filing started tonight," I said. "No fault, Connecticut's clean about it, I want it filed Monday morning at the absolute latest." "Understood. What about the house?" "The house stays with DRC Holdings. It was never a marital asset to begin with, and now 40 witnesses watched her father confirm that in real time, which I imagine will save us both a great deal of litigation." "That's a gift, honestly," Renata said. "What about Northline? Any equity claims to worry about?" "None. She was never involved in the company. Never once asked to see a cap table, never contributed labor or capital. I've kept meticulous separation there specifically because I've watched what happens to founders who don't." I paused. "I want this done quietly, Renata. No press, no drama on my end. I'm not interested in humiliating her the way she tried to humiliate me. I just want it finished. Cleanly." "I can do quiet," she said. "I can't promise her family will do quiet." She was right about that, as it turned out, but not in the way either of us expected. The second call I made was to my brother, Sam. Sam is 36, runs a commercial HVAC company out of Providence, married with 2 kids, and is, along with my father, the only person in this world I've never once had to explain myself to. He picked up on the first ring. "Whitney's mother called Mom 20 minutes ago. he said before I'd even said hello, screaming about how you humiliated the family in front of half of Fairfield County. Mom hung up on her. That's not exactly the order of events, I said. I figured. What happened? I told him. I heard him go quiet the way he does when he's genuinely angry, a stillness that's louder than shouting. You want me to come get you? He asked. I can be there in 90 minutes. I'm fine, Sam. I'm at the Marriott. You're not fine, you just don't process it that way, he said, which was, I've since had time to reflect, an entirely accurate assessment. I'm coming anyway. Bringing beer. Don't argue with me, I've had this conversation with you before. He showed up 2 hours later with a case of beer and the same quiet, steady presence he's had since we were kids, since our father taught us both that the measure of a man wasn't how loud he got when things went wrong but how clearly he could still think. We sat on the small balcony of my apartment, looking out at a skyline that had nothing in common with the manicured lawns of Weston, and for a long stretch neither of us said much of anything at all. You remember the 4th of July at their place, 2 summers back? Sam asked eventually. When Edmund introduced you to his golf buddies as Whitney's husband, does something with computers? I wanted to say something that day. You told me not to. I remember, I said. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. You always tell yourself that, Sam said, not unkindly. You're the most patient negotiator I've ever met in a boardroom and the most patient doormat I've ever met at a family dinner. Same guy, different rooms, completely different rules. That's fair, I admitted. You gonna be different now? I think I already was, today, I said. I just didn't get the chance to prove it until they handed it to me on a lawn. He asked once, late in the evening, whether I thought Whitney had ever really loved me, and I told him the truth, which was that I thought she had, once, before 4 years of her family's slow campaign had convinced her that loving me was something to apologize for. Doesn't excuse the lawn thing, Sam said. No, I agreed. It doesn't. The third call, made the next morning, was to my father. Walt Callahan is 68 years old, retired from the machine shop for 6 years now, still fixes his own gutters, still doesn't fully trust anyone who wears a suit for a living even though his own son does. I called him Sunday morning, told him what happened. He was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, the particular quiet he goes into when he's thinking rather than reacting. Did you handle yourself right? He asked finally. I think so. Did you yell at her? No. Good, he said. Man who yells has already lost the argument, he just hasn't figured it out yet. Another pause. You gonna be alright? I don't know yet. That's an honest answer, he said. I'm proud of you for giving it to me instead of the other one. He cleared his throat, the way he does before he says something he means more than he's comfortable saying. You didn't come from money, Derek. Neither did I. Doesn't mean you came from nothing. Don't you let that family make you forget that. I hadn't planned on it mattering as much as it did, hearing my father say that. But it did. By Monday morning, the divorce filing was in motion, and the story of what happened at the Sinclair Garden Party had, predictably, made its way through every corner of Weston's social circuit, the version that circulated bearing less and less resemblance to what actually happened with each retelling, the way these things always do. In one version I heard secondhand, I'd shown up drunk and started throwing my own belongings. In another, Harold Whitfield had been paid off years in advance to lie about the title transfer. People believe the version that costs them the least to believe, and for the Sinclair's circle, the version where I was the villain cost them nothing at all. I didn't correct any of it. I've learned, over 20 years of business, that trying to control a narrative you don't need to win is a waste of energy better spent on the things you actually do need to win. The Monday after the party, I went into the Northline office at 7 in the morning, the same time I always did, because I've learned over the years that routine is one of the few things in this life that will hold your weight when everything else gives out from under you. My head of operations, a woman named Priya who'd been with me since year 2, took one look at me in the hallway and asked if I wanted to talk about it. Word had apparently already reached the office by then, filtered through some mutual acquaintance in the Weston social circuit, the way these things do. Not particularly, I said. I'd rather look at the Denver numbers. Copy that, she said, and didn't bring it up again, which is one of 100 small reasons I've never once regretted building a team of people who understood that work could be a place you went to be steady when nothing else was. I spent that week the way I've spent the hardest weeks of my career, buried in the parts of the business that made sense to me when very little else did. I sat in on 4 client calls I didn't strictly need to be on. I rewrote a section of our onboarding documentation that had been bothering me for months. I stayed until 9 most nights, not because there was urgent work waiting, but because the apartment, quiet and half familiar after 2 years away from it, wasn't somewhere I was ready to sit still in yet. What I focused on instead, over the following 6 weeks, was quieter, and more permanent. Edmund Sinclair's hotel group, I discovered through routine due diligence Renata ran as part of the divorce proceedings, financial documentation for the joint tax filings we'd had over the years, had been carrying more debt than the family's public image suggested. 3 of the 11 properties were leveraged against a credit line that had been extended 18 months earlier, around the same time, as it happens, that Edmund had needed cash for the foundation repair on Brookhaven Lane and come to me instead of his bank, because his bank, I now understood, had already tightened his available credit that year. The $90,000 personal loan I'd forgiven in exchange for the title transfer hadn't been a favor between family. It had been a lifeline, dressed up as a wedding gift's aftercare. I want to be clear about something here, because I think it matters. I did not go after Edmund Sinclair's business. I want to say that plainly, because there's a version of this story, the version some of you are probably expecting, where I use what I learned to dismantle his hotel company out of spite, the way you sometimes see in these stories, and that is not what happened, and I don't think it would have made me feel any better if it had. What I did was simpler, and in its own way, more final. Renata called me on a Wednesday afternoon, 4 weeks into the process, with the tone she uses when she's found something she wants to walk through carefully rather than just summarize over the phone. I drove to her office in Providence that same evening. She had a folder laid out across the conference table, bank statements and refinancing documents pulled from the joint tax filings Whitney and I had filed together for 3 years, the kind of paperwork nobody reads closely during a marriage because there's no reason to, until suddenly there is. 3 of the 11 properties are leveraged against a credit line Edmund opened 18 months ago, she said, sliding a page toward me. Right around the same time he came to you for the foundation repair money instead of going to his own bank. His bank had already tightened him, I said, understanding before she finished the sentence, the same way I understand a deal structure the moment the second document lands on the table. That's my read too, she said. The $90,000 loan you forgave wasn't generosity between family, Derek. It was liquidity he badly needed and didn't want to explain to anyone at that dinner table. The house transfer wasn't really a business decision on his end. It was survival, dressed up as a favor to a son-in-law. I sat with that for a while, looking at numbers that reframed 4 years of quiet condescension into something closer to a man protecting a business that was far shakier than the story he told at every party ever let on. It didn't make me angry, exactly. It made the whole thing feel smaller than it had ever been allowed to feel at that dinner table, a family that had spent years making me feel lucky to be there, propped up in part by money I'd quietly provided without anyone acknowledging it. What do you want to do with this? Renata asked. Nothing to Edmund directly, I said. I'm not interested in taking his company apart. I want it documented, and I want to understand exactly where my own exposure ends, and that's it. I called Blake Whitmore. I'd learned, through the same due diligence, that Blake held a minority investment position in 2 of Edmund's properties, positions that had, over the years, given him a seat at more family dinners and more strategic conversations than his actual capital contribution probably justified, the kind of access that comes from being liked rather than being needed. I called him on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the garden party, and I asked him, calmly, whether he was aware that the properties he'd invested in were carrying undisclosed leverage that hadn't been reflected in the offering materials he'd been shown 2 years earlier. He wasn't aware. I could hear it in the long pause before he answered. Why are you telling me this? Blake asked, after the long pause, his voice carrying the particular defensiveness of a man who already suspects the answer isn't going to be flattering. Because you're an investor, I said, and I've spent my career believing investors deserve accurate information about what they're actually holding, regardless of how I feel about them personally. I don't think Edmund misled you deliberately. I think he's been managing a business under more pressure than he's let any of us see, for longer than any of us realized, and information like that has a way of staying buried at family dinners until someone finally opens the right folder. You could have just let me find out the hard way, he said. God knows I'd have deserved it. Maybe, I said. I decided I'd rather not build my next few years around being the kind of person who let someone walk into a loss I could have warned them about, even someone I have every reason to dislike. That's not really about you, Blake. It's about who I want to be able to look at in the mirror. He didn't say anything for a moment. For what it's worth, he said finally, I am sorry. About Whitney. About the party. I don't have a good excuse for any of it. I'm not looking for one, I said, and I meant it. Get your position reviewed. That's really all I called to say. I didn't tell him to pull out. I didn't have to. I simply told him what I'd found, told him he might want independent counsel to review his position before the next capital call, and let him draw his own conclusions about a family that had, apparently, been managing information the same way with him as they had with everyone else at that dinner table. 6 weeks later, I heard through the same social circuit that had once carried gossip about my humiliation that Blake Whitmore had quietly exited both positions and was no longer being seen around Weston at all. Whether that had anything to do with Whitney, I genuinely don't know, and I've made a point of not asking. Because here's the thing I want you to understand about how I actually spent those 6 weeks. I wasn't trying to destroy anyone. I was doing something much simpler, and much older than revenge. I was removing myself, cleanly and completely, from every piece of infrastructure that had let that family treat me like furniture for 4 years. I closed the joint accounts. I moved my personal files and my father's old watch, the one thing of his I'd kept in that house's study, back to my own apartment in Providence, the one I'd never quite let go of even after we married, some instinct in me apparently having always known I might need it again. I finalized the divorce filing with Renata, clean, no fault, no contest on the house because there was nothing left to contest. And on a Tuesday evening in late July, 6 weeks after the garden party, Whitney came to see me. If you're enjoying this story so far, I'd love it if you dropped a comment below about a time you had to walk away from people who never respected what you built. I read every single one, and it always shapes the stories we tell next. She showed up at my apartment in Providence unannounced, which surprised me, because she'd never once, in 6 years together, willingly set foot in that building. She stood in the doorway in jeans and an old sweatshirt I recognized from years earlier, nothing like the composed, curated woman who'd stood on that porch throwing my clothes into the roses. "Can I come in?" she asked. I let her in. We sat at the small kitchen table, the same one Harold had once spread closing documents across at the house neither of us lived in anymore, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. "I've been thinking about what to say to you for 6 weeks, she said finally. "I still don't have it figured out." "You could start with why," I said. She was quiet for a while. "I think I started being embarrassed by you before I even understood I was doing it," she said. "It wasn't the money, Derek, you made more than my father most years, everyone knew that even if nobody said it out loud. It was that you didn't need any of them. You built something from nothing, and it made you free of them in a way I never was. I think some part of me resented that, because I never figured out how to be free of them myself." She looked down at her hands. "Blake never made me feel like that. He fit into their world without trying. Being with him felt like not having to choose. You didn't have to humiliate me on a lawn in front of 40 people to leave me, Whitney," I said. "You could have just told me the truth, 6 weeks earlier, in private, like an adult." "I know," she said, and her voice cracked slightly. "I wanted an audience. I wanted my parents to see me finally standing up to something, even if the something was you, even if you didn't deserve it. I've spent 4 years watching them treat you like you were lucky to be there, and some sick part of me wanted, just once, to be the one holding the power in that house instead of the one everyone felt sorry for. She looked up at me. I know how that sounds. It sounds honest, I said. That's more than I got on the lawn. I didn't know about the house, she said. I want you to know that. I didn't know my father had signed it over. Finding that out in front of everyone was, she stopped. I've never seen my father look smaller than he did in that moment. I don't think I've fully forgiven you for that. I never told you because I didn't think I needed a reason to protect what I'd built, I said. I didn't do it to embarrass your father. I did it because $200,000 of my money went into that house's foundation, and I've spent my whole career learning not to leave assets exposed to people who don't actually respect what I bring to the table. Your family taught me that lesson themselves, Whitney, dinner by dinner, for 4 years. I just happened to apply it to real estate before I applied it to the marriage. She didn't have an answer for that. We sat there a while longer, the silence less hostile than it had been at the start, something closer to two people quietly grieving the same thing from opposite sides. Was there a specific moment, I asked, where you decided? Or did it just happen slowly, the way you're describing it? She thought about that for longer than I expected. There was a night in April, she said finally, when I told you I was at a committee meeting. You never said anything, but I always wondered if you knew. You had this look when I got home. I knew, I said. I didn't say anything because I wanted to see what you'd do with more rope, I suppose. That's not something I'm proud of, in hindsight. I think some part of me was running my own marriage like a negotiation instead of a marriage, waiting to see the other side's full position before I moved. That's very you, she said, and there was no bitterness in it, just a kind of tired recognition. You've always needed to see the whole board before you make a move. I used to find that reassuring. Somewhere in the last year I think I started finding it exhausting. Like I was a line item you were monitoring instead of a person you were married to. Maybe, I said. Or maybe I was monitoring the marriage because every time I tried to raise something directly, your family found a way to make it about my background instead of the actual problem. I got tired of losing that argument before I even opened my mouth. She didn't deny it. My father asked me, the week after the party, she said, whether I thought you'd known about the affair before that day. I told him I didn't know. I still don't, actually. Did you? I knew something was happening, I said. I didn't know it was Blake specifically until you said his name on the lawn. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think you deserve at least one honest thing today. I'd built a folder. Dates, inconsistencies, things that didn't add up. I never once opened it looking for a name. I think I was building it the way you build a case file before a deposition, not because I wanted to catch you, but because some part of me needed proof before I let myself believe what I already knew. That's a very lonely way to spend a marriage, she said quietly. It was, I agreed. I think we were both lonely in it, honestly. Just in different directions. She was quiet for a while after that, turning her coffee mug slowly on the table without drinking from it. I am sorry, she said eventually, standing to leave. For the lawn. I mean that specifically. I could have ended it 100 better ways and I chose the cruelest one because I wanted witnesses. That was about me, not about you deserving it. I believe you, I said. And I did. Take care of yourself, Derek. You too. She left, and I sat at that kitchen table for a long time afterward, thinking about 4 years, about foundations, literal and otherwise, and about the particular kind of clarity that only shows up after you've lost something you spent a long time protecting. The divorce finalized in September, 11 weeks after the garden party, faster and cleaner than either attorney had initially projected, largely because there was so little left to fight over. Whitney didn't contest the house. She didn't contest Northline. She asked for, and received, half the value of a joint investment account we built together over the marriage, which Renata and I had both agreed from the start was fair, regardless of everything else, because that money had genuinely been built together, in a way the house never had been. Edmund Sinclair's hotel group, for what it's worth, is still operating. Still 11 properties, last I heard, though I understand 2 of them changed hands in a refinancing deal that quietly cut Blake Whitmore's remaining position out entirely. I don't know the details, and I've made a point of not learning them. I wasn't interested in watching Edmund lose everything. I was only ever interested in making sure nothing of mine was still standing on ground he controlled. Harold Whitfield still lives next door to the house on Brookhaven Lane, which I still technically own through DRC Holdings, though I've since listed it, because I have no interest in living in a house I associate with a rose bush full of my own suits. He and I have dinner about once a month now, at a diner halfway between his place and mine, and he still won't tell me exactly what made him decide, that particular Saturday, to walk over and say my name out loud to 40 strangers instead of staying quietly on his own side of the hedge. Felt like the moment called for it, is all he'll ever say. I've stopped pushing for more than that. Some kindnesses don't need an explanation. Preston Sinclair, as far as I know, still works in business development at his father's company. Constance still tells the story of the gift house at parties, I'm told, though I understand the ending has changed considerably since June. 2 months after the divorce finalized, I got a call from a man named Victor Alonso, a partner at a growth equity firm in Boston who'd heard, through channels I never fully traced, about the Cleveland deal and the fuel savings numbers behind it. He didn't mention the divorce. He didn't mention Weston, or the Sinclairs, or anything about my personal life at all, which I appreciated more than I let on at the time. We're building a thesis around supply chain infrastructure for mid-market carriers, he said. Your name kept coming up as someone who understood the space better than most people building software for it. I'd like to talk about what a growth round might look like for Northline, if you're open to it. I told him I had some time the following week. We met at a coffee shop near my office, no vineyard trellises, no string quartet, just 2 people with a shared spreadsheet and a genuine interest in the numbers on it. 4 months later, Northline closed a $22 million growth round, the largest capital event in the company's history, led by Victor's firm, with 2 of our existing enterprise clients rolling in as strategic investors alongside it. Nobody at that closing dinner asked me what I did with trucks. Nobody redirected the conversation toward a hotel booking system that didn't exist. I sat at a table of people who had read the deck, understood the 11%, and wanted to be part of what came next, and I found myself thinking, more than once that evening, about a wedding toast that had once forgotten to mention my name at all. And me, 6 months after the garden party, I moved back into my old apartment in Providence permanently, the one I'd kept through the whole marriage without ever quite admitting to myself why. Northline closed a second major carrier contract that fall, our best quarter in company history, and I found myself working the kind of long, absorbed hours I hadn't allowed myself in years, because there was no dinner waiting at a house that had never really been mine to begin with, no performance of a marriage to maintain on the drive home. There is something clarifying, I've come to learn, about the thing you feared most actually happening. You spend years bracing for a version of collapse you've built up in your head into something unsurvivable, and then it happens, all at once, in front of 40 strangers on a lawn, and you find out, standing in the wreckage of your own suitcase, that you're still standing. That the ground under you, quite literally in my case, was more solid than anyone standing on it with you had ever bothered to check. I ran into Edmund once, about 3 months after the divorce, at an industry mixer in Hartford I'd only attended because a client had asked me to be there. He was near the bar, alone, looking older than I remembered him looking at any dinner table in Weston. He saw me before I saw him, and for a moment I thought he might simply turn away, the way people do when they've decided a conversation isn't worth the discomfort. Instead, he walked over. "Derek," he said. "Edmund. I owe you an apology," he said, which was not something I'd ever heard him say to anyone at any dinner table in 4 years. "Not for the house. That was a business decision, and I stand by the terms even if I regret not telling Whitney directly. I mean for the dinners. Years of them. I let my family treat you like you hadn't earned your seat at that table, and the truth is you were the only person at it who'd actually built anything himself. I didn't say anything right away. I hadn't expected the apology, and I found I didn't need it the way I might have needed it a year earlier. I appreciate you saying that, I said finally. I don't think it changes much at this point, but I appreciate it. I know, he said. I'm not asking it to change anything. I just wanted to have said it out loud, once, before too much time passed and I convinced myself I didn't need to. We didn't talk much longer than that. He asked, briefly, how Northline was doing, and for the first time in 4 years, I got the sense he was actually listening to the answer rather than waiting for his turn to talk about hotels. It didn't undo 4 years of dinners. I want to be honest about that. But it was something, and I've come to believe that some apologies matter even when they arrive too late to change anything, simply because they mean the person finally saw clearly what they'd spent years refusing to look at directly. I ran into Whitney once, about 4 months after the divorce finalized, at a coffee shop in downtown Providence, of all places, a city she'd never once expressed interest in visiting during our marriage. She was there for a work thing, she said, some interior design consultation, and we stood for a moment in that particular half-uncomfortable, half-gentle way you do with someone you used to build a whole life around. You look good, she said. Lighter. I feel lighter, I admitted. I heard Northline's doing well. It is. She nodded, and there was something genuine in it, none of the performance from the lawn, none of the practiced cruelty. I'm glad, she said. I mean that. Whatever else, I always did think what you built was real. I think I just didn't know how to sit next to it without feeling small. I didn't have a perfect response for that, and I've come to believe some things just don't need one. Take care of yourself, Whitney. You too, Derek. We went our separate ways down Westminster Street, and that was, as far as I know, the last time I'll ever speak to her. My name is Derek Callahan. I'm 39 years old. I own a logistics software company I built out of my own apartment with nothing but a laptop and a decade of being told I didn't have the right background to matter. I spent 4 years married into a family that made me feel, dinner after dinner, like I was lucky to be given a seat at their table, and I have spent the 6 months since learning, slowly and deliberately, what it feels like to sit at tables I built myself instead. I didn't destroy anyone that summer. I want to be honest about that, because I think there's a satisfying version of this story where I burned the whole Sinclair empire to the ground out of spite, and that was never who I wanted to be, not even in the worst moment of that marriage. What I did was simpler. I protected what was mine. I told the truth when I finally had the chance to. And I walked away, quietly, from a family that had spent 4 years teaching me exactly how little they thought I was worth, right up until the moment they discovered the ground under their own feet belonged to me the whole time. I think about that afternoon on the lawn sometimes, my suits scattered across the roses, my golf clubs broken across the driveway, and I don't feel angry when I remember it anymore. I feel something closer to gratitude, strange as that sounds. Because it took Whitney throwing my life onto the street, in front of everyone who'd ever made me feel small, for me to finally understand that I'd spent 4 years protecting a foundation that was never going to hold anything up for me in return. I think, too, about all the dinners before that one, the ones where I let a comment slide because raising it felt like more trouble than it was worth, the ones where Whitney squeezed my hand under the table instead of speaking up out loud. The ones where I told myself that patience was the same thing as strength. I don't think patience was ever the problem. I think the problem was that I spent 4 years being patient with people who had never once extended me the same courtesy, and I mistook my own restraint for a kind of nobility instead of recognizing it, plainly, as a slow erosion of my own sense of what I was owed. There's a version of me, from before that Saturday, who would have stayed quiet a while longer. Who would have absorbed the lawn the way I absorbed the toast at my own wedding, the way I absorbed the software thing at 100 dinners, filing it away as one more thing to let go of for the sake of peace. I don't think that version of me was weak, exactly. I think he was doing the only thing he knew how to do with people he still hoped might eventually come around. But he was wrong about one thing, and it took a suitcase on a lawn to teach it to him. Some people don't come around. Some people only ever recalibrate the moment they're forced to, the moment the ground beneath their own feet turns out to belong to someone else. Harold said my name that day, and something in me has never stopped being grateful he did. Not because it won me the house, though it did. Because it was the first time in 4 years someone in that world had looked at me and said, out loud, in front of everyone, that I mattered enough to be named. I've thought since then about how small a thing that is to be grateful for, saying someone's name, and how enormous it felt in that moment, after 4 years of being introduced as the software thing, after a wedding toast that forgot I existed, after 100 dinners where my name was the one word nobody at that table seemed to need. I still own the house on Brookhaven Lane, technically, through DRC Holdings, though I've listed it, and I understand a young couple from Fairfield made an offer on it last month. People with no history with the Sinclairs at all, who will never know what that lawn once held. I hope they plant something new in those rose bushes. I hope, whatever they build in that house, nobody in it ever has to learn what I learned there, that the people who are supposed to make you feel like you belong somewhere are sometimes the last people who'll ever tell you the truth about whether you do. If this story hit you, let me know in the comments. Tell me about the moment you found out the ground you were standing on was more solid than the people who tried to make you feel small ever gave you credit for. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe, because we've got a lot more of them coming.